The dusty field tent in northern Italy was stifling, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the nervous sweat of staff officers. It was late July 1943. 3 weeks had passed since the Allies had stormed the beaches of Sicily in Operation Husky. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, stood over a map table, his eyes tracing the chaotic blue lines of the American advance. He was not technically in command of the Sicilian defense that headache belonged to Field Marshal Kesselring, but Rommel's new assignment as commander of Army Group B meant the defense of Italy would soon fall to him. He was watching the Americans closely. According to the classified narrative you've referenced, it was here that Rommel drafted a memo that would become legendary for its prescience. He warned the German High Command that the American general leading the 7th Army, George S. Patton, was a new kind of enemy. He warned that Patton fought with a speed and ferocity unlike the cautious British or the inexperienced Americans they had crushed at Kasserine Pass. Rommel's subordinates, confident in the superiority of the Wehrmacht, reportedly laughed it off. They saw Patton as a caricature, a loud-mouthed cowboy with pearl-handled revolvers who cared more about glory than tactics. To them he was reckless, undisciplined, and strategically unsound. They were wrong, and as Rommel feared, their arrogance would result in one of the most devastating displays of mobile warfare the world had ever seen. The ghost of Kasserine. To understand why the German officers laughed, one must understand the context of 1943. The German military machine, though battered by Stalingrad and El Alamein, still considered itself the tactical superior of any army on earth. Their view of the American soldier was particularly low. Months earlier, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, Rommel's Afrika Korps had humiliated the U.S. The Second Corps. The Americans had been disorganized, hesitant, and easily panicked. The Germans concluded that while the Americans had endless supplies and trucks, they lacked the killer instinct of the veteran German grenadier. They viewed American generals as managers rather than warriors, cautious men who wouldn't move without massive artillery support. When Operation Husky began on July 10, 1943, the German plan relied on this assessment. They assumed the British 8th Army, led by the methodical Bernard Montgomery, was the real threat. They believed the Americans on the left flank were merely a supporting force, there to guard Montgomery's rear while he drove up the coast to Messina. The German officers, reading Rommel's warning, looked at Patton and saw a clown. They heard stories of him reciting poetry in the heat of battle, his obsession with uniforms, and his high-pitched squeaky voice. They didn't see a strategist. They saw a peacock. The cowboy unleashed what Rommel had seen in those first 3 weeks, however, was that Patton was not fighting the war the Germans expected. He was fighting a war of movement. While Montgomery was bogged down by fierce German resistance near Catania, Patton was growing restless. The original Allied plan called for Patton to inch forward slowly, protecting Monty's flank. It was a role Patton despised. "I am not a flank guard," he growled to his staff. "I am a winner," without explicit permission from the Allied High Command, and defying the expectations of the Germans. Patton ordered the 7th Army to swivel. Instead of pushing east with the British, he turned his tanks west and north, aiming for the port city of Palermo. This was the moment the German officers had dismissed as reckless. In traditional military doctrine, splitting your forces and racing into the enemy rear without secured supply lines was suicide. It was the move of a cowboy. But Patton understood something the German staff officers, entrenched in their rigid academies, did not. Speed is security. The race to Palermo. The devastation Rommel predicted began with the drive to Palermo. Patton pushed his men to the breaking point. He was everywhere at the front lines, directing traffic at crossroads, screaming at mule drivers, and standing upright in his jeep as shells fell around him. The speed of the American advance was terrifying. The infantry, stripping down to their undershirts in the blistering Sicilian heat, marched at a pace that stunned the enemy. "We drive them until they drop," Patton said, "and then we drive them some more." The German and Italian defenders in western Sicily were not outgunned. They were outpaced. Before they could set up a defensive line, Patton's Sherman tanks were already behind them. Before they could blow a bridge, American engineers were already repairing it. In just 4 days, Patton's troops covered over 100 miles of mountainous terrain. On July 22nd, Patton rolled into Palermo. The cowboy had captured a major port and cleared the entire western half of the island, while the more disciplined British army was still stuck in the mud on the east coast. The German High Command was stunned. The undisciplined Americans had executed a blitzkrieg faster than the Wehrmacht itself. Rommel's warning echoed in the silence of the headquarters. Patton is unlike any American general. The devastating fulfillment, however, the true fulfillment of the warning, the devastating consequence came during the final drive to Messina. After taking Palermo, Patton turned his army east to crush the Germans trapped between him and Montgomery. The terrain was a nightmare. Jagged peaks, narrow roads, and thousands of German mines. This was defensive ground that should have held for months. The Germans, now under the command of General Hans Valentin Hube, dug in. They expected the Americans to slow down, to bombard every ridge before advancing. They expected the safe approach. Instead, Patton launched a series of amphibious end runs. When the Germans blocked the road, Patton didn't wait to clear it. He put soldiers on boats and landed them behind the German lines. It was a tactic of immense risk, requiring precise coordination and nerves of steel. At the Battle of Troina, the fighting was brutal. The Germans held a fortified mountain peak, raining fire down on the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. For days, the Americans threw themselves at the rock. A lesser general would have pulled back and called for air support for a week. Patton ordered relentless pressure. He knew that if he stopped, the Germans would escape. The psychological impact on the German commanders was profound. They realized they were facing a mirror image of their own best panzer generals, a man who preferred blood and guts to caution. They could not rest. They could not regroup. Every time they looked over their shoulder, Patton's tanks were there. The climax of the campaign was the race to Messina, the gateway to Italy. Montgomery, the supposed star of the Allied show, was miles behind. Patton was obsessed with beating him there, not just for ego, but to prove to the world and the Germans that the American soldier was second to none. On August 17, 1943, Patton's patrol entered Messina. When the British column finally rolled into town hours later, they found Patton waiting for them. He had conquered the island in 38 days. The consequences for the Germans were catastrophic. While they managed to evacuate many men across the strait, they had lost Sicily, a fortress they believed would hold the Allies for months in mere weeks. They lost over 150,000 men killed, wounded or captured, and vast quantities of material. But the most devastating loss was psychological. The myth of German superiority over the American fighting man was shattered. Rommel's warning had come true. The Americans had found a general who fought with the ruthlessness of a stormtrooper and the speed of a cavalryman. The legacy of the warning. The officers who laughed at Rommel's warning in July stopped laughing by August. The cowboy had destroyed their defensive plans, not by following the rules, but by breaking them. Rommel's fear was validated again and again. Later in the war, during the invasion of Normandy, the German high command would become so obsessed with Patton that they kept their best divisions waiting at Pas-de-Calais, convinced that Patton would lead the real invasion there, even though he was actually sitting in England with a fake army of balloon tanks. They never underestimated him again. The tragedy for the Germans was that by the time they respected Patton, it was too late. He had already torn through their lines, just as the Desert Fox had predicted he would. Insights for the user. This history highlights a critical lesson in leadership and competition. Bias blinds us to capability. The German officers were blinded by their cultural superiority complex. They couldn't conceive that an undisciplined American could master the art of mobile warfare.